Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Hartlepool. On the panel, Lee Rowley, former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, now Business and Industry Minister and a Government Whip, charged with making sure Tory MPs follow the party line. Labour's Shadow Housing Secretary, a member of the front bench team under Ed Miliband, and briefly, Jeremy Corbyn, Lucy Powell. Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of the Energy Industry Trade Association Energy UK, previously Head of Climate Change at World Wildlife Fund UK. Tom Newton Dunn, The Sun's political editor for 11 years, since last year, presenter and chief political commentator at Times Radio. And writer, strategist, mental health campaigner and former number 10 Director of Communications for Tony Blair, Alastair Campbell. Good evening, welcome to my panel, welcome to our audience here in Hartlepool, great to see you, and of course welcome to you at home. Do join in the conversation the usual way, you know how by now, on social media at BBC Question Time. OK, let's hear our first question, which is from David Walker.
Do you think that being an MP is a part-time job?
Lee.
No, I personally don't. I've not had a second job since I became the MP for North East Derbyshire in 2017. I think there is an enormous amount of work that can be done in the constituency, and there's an enormous amount of work down in Westminster. At the same time, I recognise that there are a number of my colleagues, historically on all benches, who have taken other incomes, who have taken other jobs. And I think what we've got to decide...
I think the name we're all dancing around here is Geoffrey Cox, isn't it? And the huge amounts he makes as a QC.
Along with others. I think what we've got to decide as a society is what we want in terms of our parliamentarians. Because I absolutely want parliamentarians who focus on their constituency. That's what we're there for. But we also want parliamentarians who write good legislation. And that requires them to have some real-life experience, and sometimes it requires them to be able to have experience, quite recent experience, of what's going on in the real world. I left my job 4 years ago. I'm a bit rusty. Now, I've chosen not to stay in my job. I've chosen to focus on being an MP, but I don't think it is the worst thing in principle for other people to bring their experience into Parliament that they have done recently so that they can help, hopefully, write better laws.
So is Geoffrey Cox right to spend some weeks in the British Virgin Islands? He was given permission to do so by the Whip's office. Was that the right move, or was he right to do it?
Well, ultimately, that is a judgment call for individual MPs and then ultimately their constituents. And Geoffrey Cox has been re-elected multiple times, originally from a Lib Dem seat. He won that seat from another party, and he now has a very hefty majority, and this has been looked at on multiple occasions by the electorate. But ultimately, if Geoffrey Cox has done something wrong, then there's a process that will be followed, and at the end of it, there will be a sanction of it. But I do think we have to let decisions by MPs stand, and then their constituents will judge them.
Alastair.
I mean, the trouble with that, Lee, is that the process took its course, and then your Prime Minister and your Chief Whip and your Leader of the House got together and decided that because they didn't like the judgment against one of their Brexit friends, Owen Paterson, they should change the whole damn system. Mm-hmm. And you and the Whips corralled your MPs, and a few of them, I think with real sort of courage and integrity, said they weren't going to have it, and the whole thing, rightly in my view, blew up in your face. Now, where I agree with you, I think there's nothing wrong with MPs having all sorts of interests outside Parliament. But I'd love it just every now and then if they said that their second job was working in a food bank, or their second job was, you know, going working for a charity, which I know some of them do, but not the ones that we hear about. And here's the other thing. Geoffrey Cox, as I understand it, has made £6 million in recent years, which, as somebody pointed out, that's worth 2 peerages in Tory money. And he has done that as in a, you know, as you say, now a pretty safe seat. The idea that the next chance the electorate get the chance to have a say on that is in some years off in an election. But here's the other thing. A lot of politics is about leadership. There are 7 principles, the Nolan principles, that were brought in when John Major was Prime Minister. Honesty, openness, objectivity, selflessness, integrity, accountability, and leadership. The problem is Boris Johnson drives a horse and coaches through those day after day after day after day. And he's an MP, and a Prime Minister, by the way, who, when he was an MP, earned even more than Geoffrey Cox has been earning, but thought that £250,000 for his column in The Telegraph was chicken feed. Thought that his £15, £20, £30,000 speaking fees were chicken feed. If you have somebody like Johnson, who to my mind has zero moral compass, zero honesty, zero integrity, zero accountability, MPs will take the mick, they're taking the mick, and these guys have to go along with it because he's the boss.
Yes, the man in the blue sweater.
Yeah, I think in terms of MPs taking the mick, I think there's a degree of Tory complacency at the moment because there's not a credible opposition. There hasn't been a credible opposition for a while. So now Tories think that they can get away with things. They can use their offices for things. They can go abroad. It's not going to matter. People are still going to vote for them. And in terms of having a second job, I think, again, it depends if you can do both jobs, especially being the MP, well. I mean, some people do Question Time and Antiques Roadshow, and as long as you can do them both fine, then, you know, good on them.
Wondering how to cope with that particular point.
What do you say to that, Fiona?
Yeah, what do I say to that? I say neither is a full-time job, but together they are a full-time job. That's what I'd say to that. Yes, the man there in the grey shirt.
Hello. I think there's something fundamentally immoral about spending more time away at a second job rather than being in your constituency serving the people that voted you into Parliament in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, in Geoffrey Cox's case, for example, we don't know that he was spending more time doing the other job.
I just mean in general. For
Okay.
example, there are GPs who are doing good work for the NHS, but maybe some jobs aren't as important as the other.
Okay, and the man behind you in the black shirt.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I 100% agree with Alastair.
Right thing to say.
And why can't you believe what you're saying?
Some of the things he said in the past on television, I've disagreed with him quite profoundly. But I think many MPs genuinely believe that £82,000 a year is simply not enough money. And that it needs to be topped up by outside work. But of course, you can never say that to the electorate, the majority of which do not earn £82,000 a year.
Okay. Tom?
Well, the honest answer to the question is, of course, if you're an MP, that should be your primary job. I, probably like a lot of other people here, wouldn't completely ban all second jobs. I actually think it is quite useful having a bit of experience, which you can remain current on, then bring in to Parliament. It's the type of job I think we're talking about. I don't think you ban a doctor or a nurse. The reservists in the armed forces, members of Parliament, quite good for them to go and see the front line every now and then. The problem is consultancies. It's consultancies in political strategy. So in other words, you're a senior MP, you're a former minister, someone hires you to advise you on how you should go about your large company getting this legislation through, what it wants to see. That is rightfully open to a conflict of interest. Exactly what happened to Earl Patterson, it's where it went wrong. The Committee on Standards in Public Life a few years ago recommended that they be banned. Now, for 3 years, that report, which quite a significant one, has been sitting there. There's another report going on by the Standards Committee in the House of Commons. They, we all believe, are going to recommend that they're also banned, not least because of the conflict of interest point, but also the morality point, which is if you're spending your time paid for by the taxpayer, talking about policy, representing your constituents, you shouldn't be using that information to feather your own nest. It's a simple fact. We know this is going to happen. Why the government is sitting there simply waiting for the train to come down the tracks and hitting them and not getting up in front of it, Lee, is quite frankly beyond me, because it's not just the moral thing to do, it's also the right thing to do politically.
All right, let's hear a bit more from our audience. Yes, the woman here in the front.
Just something I'd like to add to this is, at the end of the day, whether you're an MP, whether you work in a supermarket, everyone's human. If people want a second job, if people want to go on holiday, let them. There's nothing wrong with that.
So you're quite happy with your MP having a second job?
I'm not. I don't think he does.
No, I'm just saying in principle you'd be happy with that idea.
I wouldn't have an issue at all.
Okay. And the woman back there, yes.
Thank you very much. Going on from what Tom said there about the Standards Committee, is now not the time that the Standards Committee should be moved to independent scrutiny and overview?
All right. Well, listen, Lee, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. But Lucy, so the question is, do you think that being an MP is a part-time job? And we heard from one member of our audience saying, well, the trouble is we haven't got a credible opposition to actually stand up for having MPs doing either being an MP full-time or at least not having lobbying jobs.
Well, look, it's absolutely not a part-time job. It's very much a full-time job, and it's not even a full-time job. It's a calling. It's a vocation. It's a way of life.
But when you say it's a full-time,
every day.
You say it's a full-time job, Lucy, but the Labour leader before he was Labour leader found time to do other work as well.
Well, it is a full-time job. It's very much a full-time job for Keir Starmer as well. And what we've got to remember here is that our boss, the boss, is the voters. It's our constituents. And so I think any suggestion that we aren't fully devoted to our constituents, that our loyalties, that our focus, that our paymasters are not our constituents, or any perception of that, that's not the case, is wrong, and that's what we need to be really clear about. But just picking up on what Alastair and Tom and others have said as well, the reason we're now engulfed in this sleaze scandal that's stopping the Prime Minister from focusing on very important issues like COP26 that's going on at the moment, the cost of living crisis, stagnant growth figures that are out today. The reason we're now engulfed in this is because there was an independent Standards Committee report, as you're asking the lady there in the audience. There was an independent standards report that had been undertaken over months and months into one of Boris Johnson's colleagues that found that he had taken money for paid advocacy, doing exactly what Tom says, and rightly so, is wrong. And the Prime Minister ordered all his MPs into the lobby to rip up that report, rip up the process around that report in order to save his mate. And his mate was banged to rights. He was guilty as charged. So this, I'm afraid, this does lie at the door of the Prime Minister, the reason that we're now having these conversations. And, it brings shame, I think, for us as a country that on the day the Prime Minister is giving a press conference, it's a global conference with the whole world watching, a chance to show us as global Britain as he wants to do, that he, instead of talking about COP26 and tackling climate change and all the issues that are involved, he's answering questions about his own MPs, his own government, his own party being corrupt.
Okay.
It's not global Britain, it's embarrassing for Britain.
Emma.
So I like members of Parliament, generally. I work with them often. I've worked with them in all my jobs, in business, but also in the third sector for a charity, and I've engaged with them on lots of issues. And I agree what others have said, that's really important. Without that partnership working, we don't get good laws. But obviously, as a person and a voter, I want my constituency MP to get their casework done and look after their local communities and focus on issues too. So I think there's violent agreement on that. For me, that means the second jobs question comes down to one of service. We expect our members of Parliament to serve. And there are some jobs like serving as a doctor during the pandemic where you can see that might add value then to a debate in Parliament. Fundamentally, there are two things I think. The first is as an employer and as an employee. If I break the rules and I do it consistently, I would expect to lose my job. I'm hoping I don't lose my job in the morning after doing this, but if there are consequences as humans, as all of us, for not sticking to the rules.
And what about Tom's point about MPs lobbying or MPs advising? I mean, your trade body represents a number of energy companies who no doubt talk to MPs.
Yeah, we do.
And seek advice from MPs.
Yeah, and I've never once paid an MP for their visa. I think, as I said, engaging with politics is a really good thing to do. We get better legislation out of it. I'm proud of some of that. The coal phase-out target, for example, or our 40 gigawatts of offshore wind target, that was business and government and the third sector working together. But I think the really crucial thing about it is transparent. You'll always know when I'm engaging with government. There's no money involved. And most of all, who wants an MP standing up and saying something just because you've paid them to do it? When MPs stand up and support my cause, I want it to be because I've won the argument with the evidence. And then lastly, on all of this, those independent reports that were done into Parliament in 2009 and 2018 said very simply, have limits, but also have transparency. Put it up on the manifestos when your candidates get elected. All of your MPs should say whether or not they intend to take paid work, and then we as voters can decide.
Okay, let's hear from you, yes, in the pink shirt, yes.
Thank you. My worry would be that a blanket ban disallowing MPs to have to give up their current vocation or their career that they've already worked hard for would leave us fishing from an even smaller pool, and that doesn't sound palatable to anyone.
I think what's clear is really consultancies and directorships, as Tom was saying, where you're taking a paid employment, paid work to either advise a company on how to navigate or, at worst, manipulate the parliamentary process in their favour, or worse, in the case of Owen Paterson, you're taking money in order to lobby, ask questions and everything else.
There is quite a simple solution here, by the way, which you might want to take away, Lee. Because when I left Number 10, and lots of people have had to do this, you have to apply for permission for everything. I can't remember if it was a year or 2 years, what it was. Everything I went to make that might make me money, whether it was writing or speaking or consultancy, whatever, I had to go and get permission from the Cabinet Office, Ethics and Propriety Office, to make sure that I wasn't entering into territory where I might be risking a conflict of interest for the government that I just left. Now, I think when MPs now are taking up paid positions, paid work, I don't see why they shouldn't have to get advance permission for that in the same way. And I think that would, I think would actually help them get out of some of the problems they've created.
Lee, I'm going to come back to you. I'm just going to take a little bit more from our audience. Yes, the woman there with the big poppy, yeah.
The average wage in the North East is 26,353. How on earth can people like Mr Cox and the Owen relate to that? It's greed. Yep. It boils down to greed.
Man there in the glasses, yes.
Yeah, Geoffrey Cox has got a safe seat, Tory safe seat. Labour thought they had a safe seat in Hartlepool until the last election, and we proved them wrong then.
OK. And the woman here in the red dress.
We've been talking about morality and the morality of taking a second job, which actually, if it actually has more money than your MP's salary, I don't think it counts as a second job.
Absolutely not.
But where's the morality in a whole load of MPs voting for something which I hope they thought was morally wrong when Boris Johnson did this, but the whip said they had to?
Are you talking about Owen Paterson?
I am.
Yes.
And, of course, it does make you wonder whether some of them were thinking, gosh, if I go against the Prime Minister, is this my chance of any advancement in the party? Will I not be a junior something or a Minister of...
We've got the man here to tell us. We've got the man here to tell us, because you are a government whip. So is that what was happening?
Well,
I mean, there were stories about MPs being told they weren't going to get funding for their constituencies, for example.
Well, I think on Monday that was confirmed that wasn't the case. There was clearly a mistake made last week, and we have accepted there was a mistake made. And the mistake was to conflate an individual case with wider considerations of whether this process worked or not. And what you've just heard for the last 5-10 minutes, both from the audience and from us, is that there are challenges with that process. And we've got to try and work out how we get a better process in place, including things like independent rights of appeal, which you would expect in a normal workplace.
I think what we've heard more about is problems with lobbying and MPs lobbying. I think that's certainly the message.
Would you ban consultancies?
And a potential, and we need to look at those kind of issues.
Would you ban consultancies?
We need to look at. I'm going to accept that there is a process about to run through the Committee of Standards, and I'm going to let those go and have a look at it and come back, because we do need to clean this up. We do need to clear up some of the issues. But I think you can see from the debate over the last 10-15 minutes, there is actually a lot of nuance under here. You take away second jobs in their entirety, you take away experience. Part of the responsibility of MPs is advocating massively for their constituencies, and I'm hugely proud to do that for North East Derbyshire. But it's also writing good laws for those constituencies. And if we don't write good laws with experience and expertise and knowledge and background, then everybody in those constituencies will not thank us in the long term.
But there is, the rules are rules. And Boris Johnson, and I found it humiliating yesterday, as Lucy said, that he stands up at COP and says Britain is not a corrupt country. That he even has to say that is humiliating for Britain. But here's the thing. He also said, if the rules are broken, MPs should be punished. He breaks the rules on the ministerial code relentlessly. There is a video, which I recommend people watch, put out by the activist Peter Stevanovic, which, with virtually no media coverage, has had 40 million views, and it just shows 7 lies that Johnson has told at the dispatch box. That, under the ministerial code, is an offence against it. If you don't correct the record, you are breaking the ministerial code. So if the Prime Minister consistently, regularly breaks the ministerial code, why shouldn't other ministers think they can do exactly the same and get away with it, as Priti Patel has done, as Michael Gove has done, as Matt Hancock did until he got caught doing something not to do with his public duties? So I really think we've just got to face up to the fact We, sadly, in my view, have elected a Prime Minister who has no moral compass whatsoever. I speak as somebody who's known him probably for longer than anybody else on this panel, and I honestly believe unless and until the Conservative Party face up to the fact he is not, as Keir Starmer said, a trivial man, he is actually a bad man, and until people face up to that, this country's politics is going to be damaged, possibly beyond repair.
Hang on, wait a second, because you all want to speak, so I'll get round you. Tom, first of all.
A tiny bit of context on this, despite Alastair's excellent soapbox attack on Boris Johnson, which I predicted he'd do on the train, and he's done it. This is wider than the Conservative Party. Ed Miliband, Labour leader until 2015, had in his manifesto a ban on consultancies, the thing that we're talking about now. And guess what? There was a Labour MP elected in 2015 called Keir Starmer on that manifesto to ban consultancies. Guess what Keir Starmer did in 2015? He took illegal consultancy. He advised the government of Gibraltar and they paid him some £9,000. So, fine, the music has stopped on the Tories' watch and Boris Johnson made an astronomical mess of it last week. But this is a cross-party problem, across politics, and not anyone on this panel should stand up with a huge amount of pride about what their party has done over the last year.
No, I disagree with you there, Tom. I'm sorry.
Which fact do you disagree with?
Because this is about, as Alastair says, this is about leadership. This is about a moral compass as well. And Keir wasn't doing a consultancy. It was a different issue about someone's professional services that they were winding down after being elected as an MP. But this is about leadership. The gentleman here raises the point about Hartlepool, because it's not just about what happens under your watch, it's about how you deal with it. What are the consequences? And we were discussing earlier that, yes, as MPs, it's pretty hard to sack us. But I tell you what, when you're in Boris Johnson's party, you're completely unsackable. You can be found guilty of sexual harassment, as one of his MPs is, and he'll tell his MPs to go through the voting lobbies, to vote for a loophole, to stop you facing a recall petition in Parliament. You can be the Home Secretary and you can be found breaking the ministerial code and bullying, and you're unsackable. You can be Owen Paterson, his mate, and you can be taking money for asking questions, and you're unsackable. Or you're Boris, or you're Matt Hancock, you're Dominic Cummings, you're unsackable. Will this guy sack anyone for doing anything wrong?
Let's hear a bit more from our audience. I'm going to move on in a minute, but yes, the man there in the shirt tie.
Thank you. Are we in danger of Boris leading his government into the corruption and sleaze of other Tory governments?
Well, can I go at that? I mean, there is. I mean, the premise of your question, sir, I think suggests gives us a clue about your thoughts, which is perfectly reasonable and perfectly acceptable. But I think I just caution my Labour friends on this panel that nobody comes out of this looking great. You know, people who are in glass houses should really not throw stones, particularly some of the people on this panel.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
What do you mean by that?
There were all members of Parliament, or there were several of us members of Parliament.
Two of us are.
And we all have had difficulties in our party historically.
It's how you deal with it, Lee. We expel people who are found guilty. We suspend people. We stop them being Labour MPs. Your guy doesn't stop anyone.
OK, hang on, one at a time.
And we've all had difficulties in our party.
He's making an allegation that I've got.
You can all pick him up on if you want to, but if you don't hear one person at a time, no one can hear anything. Lee, finish making your point of view.
We've all got difficulties in our party historically.
It's how you deal with them.
And it is about how we look at it. It is about how we make sure we get a process in place which works and has cross-party support, which was the mistake that my party made last week and which we have accepted and which we're trying now to work through. But ultimately, politics does not come out of this well if we start to thread together all different kinds of things, which isn't actually the case. You know, Alastair, you have been going on about the Prime Minister for over a decade, and yet the electorate have said consistently in 2019 that they are backing him to be the Prime Minister. Of course he makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. There are difficulties, there are problems, there are issues, particularly over the last 2 years where we've had such difficult issues. But to create this kind of conflation of nonsense, it's just inaccurate and doesn't represent what I see in Parliament or what other colleagues do.
First of all, I've not been banging on about Boris Johnson for a decade.
You have. Look at your own blog, Alastair.
I've been banging on about Boris Johnson since he led the Brexit referendum campaign on a pack of lies and he won it. And as a result of that, he became the Prime Minister. I've been banging on about him as a Prime Minister because I honestly believe he's the worst possible Prime Minister at the worst possible time. And what they do, this is out of the populist playbook, they want you to think that all politicians are as bad as each other.
Exactly.
Now, a lot of MPs are very good people in all parties, okay? Most of them are. But the idea that, say, for example, our government that that I was involved with, that when people messed up, they got fired. When we had stuff that was scandalous, it was difficult, but it was dealt with. And what I said about Boris Johnson, I would not say it about John Major because he put the Nolan principles in place. I would not say it about Theresa May because I think she had some basic honesty and dignity about her. I would definitely not say it about Margaret Thatcher. For all that I disagreed with her, I do not think she was in the public life for herself. She was there to serve the country according to her views and ideals. Boris Johnson, I'm sorry, he's not. And I know that. The people who know that, who know him know that, his friends know it, his family know it. He'll throw anybody under a bus, including you, Lee, if you get him if you fall out with him. Okay. And we have to face up to it.
And can I just
very
add,
quickly, Lucy, because I'm going to move on.
I have been accused of something here. I'm afraid that Lee and his government want to tar us all with their same tawdry brush, but I won't be tarred with your same tawdry brush. It was why I was so cross at what you did last week, because I knew it would open this can of worms. I knew it would mean that we all were brought into disrepute, because you decided to whip your MPs to rip up the rule book that governs us, and you can make your excuse if you like. But it's about how you respond to these things. We've had a Labour MP who's been found guilty in a court of law. She's been expelled from the Labour Party. We've told her to resign, and we'll be organising a ballot against her.
So
we had a Labour MP that was mentioned here earlier who was found guilty of sexual harassment. We made him resign, even though we knew it would cause us a very difficult by-election here in Hartlepool. By contrast, you've had the same allegation and charge against a Conservative MP, Bob Roberts, who not only was he not suspended, your Prime Minister whipped your MPs through the lobbies to vote for a loophole to get him off facing a recall petition, and now he's had the whip restored. It's an absolute joke what he does. So it's about leadership, it's about character, and your Prime Minister doesn't have either.
All right. I think we could spend a whole hour talking about this, but lots of you have put in other questions, and I'm determined to get to some of them. Before I do, I just want to let you know that next week we will be in Beckenham, and the week after that we'll be in Cardiff. So do come along, join the debate. It'll be pretty far, as you can see. Be part of our audience. We'd love to see you there, and you go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. So next week Cardiff, next week Beckenham, the week after that Cardiff. OK, let's take our next question, which is from Lynn Archbold.
Yeah. Is it acceptable that people are dying at home waiting for ambulances?
Lucy, so we've got a report actually today. All 14 ambulance services in the UK at the highest level of alert. People having to wait. I think that might be England, actually. No, the UK, sorry. And people waiting for ambulances to come to their home, and then when they get to the hospital, having to wait in ambulances.
Well, obviously, it's not acceptable. And I declare an interest in the spirit of the previous conversation that my husband is an A&E doctor. So I hear every evening of the terrible situation that is now facing our NHS and frontline staff, and the very difficult decisions that he and his colleagues all around the country are having to take and make. And we saw some other figures out today, didn't we? Some of the worst figures in the history of the NHS. We've now got nearly 6 million people on waiting lists.
Well, that's since records, that's 15 years, in the last 15 years.
Since records began. We've got more attendances at A&E and the worst wait times at A&E since 2015. And we've got people waiting longer for cancer treatment than at any time since records began as well. They're just a few of the terrible sort of figures that came out today. So our treasured, wonderful National Health Service that's gone through an incredibly difficult time over the last 2 years is now facing an even more difficult time. And yes, the government have set aside some extra money to deal with that. But as my husband will tell you, the hospitals and the NHS can't spend that money because they haven't got the staff, the trained staff waiting to hire to deal with some of these issues. So the government need to not just come forward with some extra funding, which is welcome, but they need to come forward with a real serious plan about how we're going to turn our NHS round so that these waiting lists can go down, people won't be suffering poor care or life-threatening situations as they potentially are. And it really is going to take a monumental effort over coming weeks and months.
Let's hear from our audience. Yes, the man here in the blue polo top.
This is not a new problem. It's not because of COVID. It's been going on for a lot of years. Locally, we've never had ambulance service support. I spent a number of days in hospital waiting for the Triple R bypass, and I had a 3-day delay because the hospital couldn't get me an ambulance to take me to another hospital to do the bypass. And the way to get the A&E waiting list down locally is to close the centre down altogether. We don't have one. So we don't have waiting lists locally. We have to travel to another town. The NHS in Hartlepool and the hospital is just run down.
Yeah.
We get promises that we're going to get investment, but we never get the investment.
Well, exactly.
And the woman here in front, yes.
I was diagnosed with primary bone cancer in 2009. So I spent a lot of time in hospital having chemo, which then led on to heart failure. I used to have a lot of hospital visits. The first time that I saw staff being stressed and patients complaining about sort of having to wait too long was when a Tory government came into power.
Okay.
And before that, they didn't at all.
The man here in the blue shirt.
Does the panel believe that our GPs maybe can do a little bit more? I've never known a time when it's so difficult to get an appointment at our GP, and we on telephones and things, so people are forced to go to A&E.
Absolutely.
Surely they could do a little bit more, in my opinion.
Tom, is it acceptable people are dying at home waiting for an ambulance? And the man there talking about GPs.
Look, it's obviously not acceptable that people are having to die at home before an ambulance arrives, or die in an ambulance because they can't get into a hospital because that hospital is full up. A&E is full up, all the wards are all full up. That's happening too. It's been happening for a while. Been interviewing people, medical professionals, saying that for over a month now. I think what is going on with the health service now is a particularly awful storm of pretty much everything that could go wrong at the same time. There's obviously COVID, which put massive pressure on the NHS for the last 18 months. We all know all about that. There's also the exploding ageing population, the demographics of our country. This is the decade where we age more than any other decade because the baby boomer generation are all retiring. The NHS is having to deal with that. People are living longer. Drugs are becoming more expensive. Everything is happening at once. I think there's a couple of things. I think short term, there is pressure on the NHS that isn't necessarily needing to be there because of the huge prevalence of COVID cases. Now, we're opening up, we're learning to live with COVID, we've got a vaccine, and that's really good. And we do have to live with this thing because it's not going anywhere, probably forever. It does appear to me it is a government choice how high that prevalence of COVID cases is, because it can, and this is always a horrendously unpopular thing to say, it can bring back mild restrictions. Not locking everyone down again, but there are things that perhaps we should deprive ourselves of our liberty, but don't necessarily have to do. Do we have to go to nightclubs all the time, whatever it might be? The government is choosing not to do that, and I think that is now going to be a question going forward as this gets worse. The other question is, do we have an NHS that is sustainable in the current shape and form and structure going forward 5 years, going forward 10 years, or do we really, in the quiet we might get after COVID, once things try and get back to normal again, think about how we start restructuring the funding and how this entire huge, very important, but slightly uncontrollable great monolith actually works.
Lee.
I mean, the answer to your question is absolutely no. The challenge at the moment, and the real challenge, is how we ensure that the health service can continue and can work and can be effective through an incredibly difficult time. We had a really difficult time over the last 18 months, but it's a different set of challenges and a different set of difficulties which we're going into now.
And what's the answer to that?
Well, at the moment, we have to keep trying incrementally to improve the position. We have to keep going at the waiting list, which is what a lot of money has gone behind to try and do. We have to keep trying to support frontline support in order to do that. But it is really difficult coming out of a pandemic. But I say this as somebody whose life was saved twice by the NHS, you know, whose parents' life has been saved.
How was your life saved twice?
Well, when I was a kid, I had very, very serious asthma, and it was very, very difficult. So, you know, I believe in the NHS. I believe in healthcare free at the point of delivery, and so do most of my colleagues. I'm afraid I don't accept the point about the Conservatives, we do believe in this thing, but we've put more money into it. We're trying to reform it. We're trying to make it better. But we've just gone through the most extraordinary pandemic, and it is going to take time to try and stabilise it and then improve it. But there's a huge amount of work going into it.
But it's not just the COVID. It's not COVID, though. This is a long time coming, and it's not just about the NHS. It's inextricably linked to social care, as Tom was saying, and the ageing population. And there have been huge cuts to adult social care. So hospitals are full with people who can't be discharged anywhere, people who should be being looked after at home, in the community, or in a care home. And your government has slashed and burned social care. You're now coming to it too late.
Helpful language, Lucy. It's really helpful language.
It's what you've done. Okay, well, what billions of pounds of cuts to social care?
It's been an extremely difficult decade, as you know, and I know we'll disagree with that in terms of because we have different ideologies. It's been a very difficult decade. We are trying to repair the nation's finances whilst trying to ensure that we support public services.
No,
and the NHS budget
so
has
hang
been
on a minute.
significantly
You believe in
since
austerity.
2010.
You believe in austerity because you believe. Well, you certainly did believe, your party did believe, coming out of 2010, that you needed to cut your way out of a crisis. You seem to have a different view now. You seem to think that you've now got to invest and level up to come out of a crisis. So you have had a change of ideology about that. But those 10 years of cuts and those 10 years of austerity have done a huge amount of damage to the NHS, which is why we've not got enough doctors, enough GPs, enough nurses, enough doctors that we can now employ to deal with this backlog. And it's under your watch that that's happened.
Emma, let me bring you in. You've been sitting there very patiently. Thank you.
Kind of agree with everyone on the panel. You know how that makes me crazy. I hear what Tom's saying. Actually, a lot of the pressures on the NHS we have seen coming for a long time. The demographic change, I certainly have known is coming for a long time. And it felt like even going into the pandemic, there were lots of conversations about how we made sure the NHS was sustainable for the future. And on that, those stories are really powerful about your cancer treatment and the treatment you have for your heart condition. I've got one of those. I had a really bad bike accident in 2015. And they got me an ambulance, primarily because I think I was lying across the road. So, you know, they needed to get me out of the way. But it took a long time to see a doctor. And I had that experience of being strapped to a gurney. They thought I'd broken my neck, left in a corridor. But not left, because the staff came back and tried to do all they could to reassure me. And it is the most frightened and most alone I've ever been, if I'm honest. But the staff were brilliant. And I didn't come out of that experience thinking, oh, we need better doctors or we need better nurses. Or even maybe that we need better GPs. I came out of it thinking there is a bad management problem happening here. And as someone who runs a business, there is a bad management problem happening, and we're not responding to the changes we've seen coming, and that is structural. It's not just about the financing, it's about the management of the system. And lastly, there's a brilliant moment in the pandemic where we all stood outside and clapped essential workers and clapped the NHS, and basically I think they need more than a clap, they need some bold ideas, and they need them now.
Okay. The woman there in the green jacket. And then
I'll saying that we haven't got enough staff now in the NHS. What's going to happen by spring next year when staff are forced to leave because they haven't had the vaccinations?
Because they haven't been double jabbed, yeah. And the man here in the pink shirt. Oh.
6 degrees of separation, but it's only about 2. When you mention anything in the health service and somebody says our GPs could do more, couldn't they? We see it in the newspapers, we see it in the targets that are being bandied around. I remember when the 5-year forward view was introduced about 6 years ago, and this was the new dawn for GPs. There was a 10-point action plan, and a few of those encouraged getting different members of healthcare teams, different professionals in to help with the demand that was in general practice. And now the latest targets are, yes, but how many people are being seen by a GP? Within 5 years, we've looked at all of the investment that was brought in and turned it back on the front line, and no wonder nobody's clapping anymore.
All right, let's hear from the woman there in the dark orange top. Yes.
Yeah. Unfortunately, my dad passed away 2 years ago, yesterday. So, and this was obviously prior to the pandemic, prior to COVID. The ambulance just didn't get there for 1 hour and 45 minutes, even though 3 phone calls were made. So the priority, and this was the city centre Newcastle Hospital, so it's not like a small Hartlepool hospital. And because it was a Friday night, A&E was overwhelmed with, you know, disorderly people from Newcastle City Centre going in there, so priority was given to them. Surely we need to have a system whereby priority is given to people who need it. So has the time come now maybe to charge for the ambulance coming out and seeing people who really need it?
Okay, and the woman behind you there, yes, with the blonde hair.
There seems to be a proliferation of private health. Since we're so short of doctors, should there be such an increase in private health? Shouldn't they be out in the NHS?
Right, so there shouldn't be private health, they should be out in the NHS.
Well, I think the government are leading it that way, aren't they?
All right, and there's a man sitting here right at the front, and you've had your hand up for ages, we haven't managed to get to you, yeah.
Firstly, before I move on to my point, I'd just like to thank Alastair for being part of the establishment that sent me and 1,000 others to Iraq all those years ago. To move on to my point, the answer's simple. Instead of taking second jobs, our NHS, our police, our public services, they're overworked and underpaid. Sort it out. This problem's been going on for far too long, yet there's no solutions. So Fiona asked you before what's the solution? How can we get around this problem?
Well, we're talking about not so much about second jobs now. We're talking about, is it acceptable that people are dying at home waiting for an ambulance?
Absolutely not. My wife's a nurse, and she's a prime example of being overworked and underpaid. During the pandemic, we all came out, we applauded, but then they're not being appreciated and they're not being recognised enough in government. And at the end of the day, money makes the world go around. How are you going to entice people to go into those kinds of professions if you're not going to pay them the money that they deserve?
Alastair.
Well, first of all, thank you for your service. And I would say that to anybody who served in the armed forces. I'm getting really worried about these attacks on GPs, which I think are being orchestrated. I want to give a shout out.
Orchestrated by who?
Well, I think part of the kind of whole right wing of the Conservative Party, the whole 55 Tufton Street agenda, they want to kind of, have a completely different model of the National Health Service, and I agree with the lady at the back that there is this push towards the private sector. I want to give a shout out to my GP, Park End Surgery. They're absolutely brilliant. Like you, I have bad asthma. I have depression. I have a couple of other ongoing issues that I have to see a doctor fairly regularly. My GP actually phoned me up during COVID and said, we're really worried about you. We haven't seen you for ages. Are you all right? And I think most GPs do a fantastic job, and I really think there's knocking them. I think it's part of this developing blame culture. We always want to blame somebody else for problems, whereas actually the job of leaders and politicians in particular is to face their own responsibilities and work out solutions to the problems that we face. Whacking GPs and somehow suggesting they're terrible, they don't work hard enough, they have been through a really tough 2 years as well. I also just want to make the point that this idea that this is all driven by COVID. Yes, COVID's been very difficult for the National Health Service, but there's an ABC at work here. A for austerity, as Lucy says. Brexit, which is taking 4% out of the economy, that's going to hit our public services very hard as well. And COVID. And D. Lee, the disastrous Prime Minister that we have as well.
Are you going to say that for every question that comes?
I'll probably
right,
okay. may have provoked me into working into every question.
Let's move on. Let's take another question from David. David Kirk, where are you?
Do you think COP26 has been a success?
All right, well, it's not quite over, but very nearly. Tom, kick us off.
Right now, there's, 196 different delegations going to stay up a very, very long time tonight and try and thrash this one through. And tomorrow, and I suspect probably into Saturday morning as well, because these things never finish on time, they'll come up with a piece of paper and they'll declare it a success. And it won't be a success as it was intended to be, because the intention is to come up with actual binding policies, which everyone signs up to, which stops the world from heating up by more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. I think we can be fairly sure now that isn't going to happen, not least because we're way away from that. 2.7, 2.4 degrees, depending who you believe. But the main players haven't even turned up. President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, 2 of the 4 biggest emitters in the world didn't bother to come. So it will fail from the high benchmark it set itself, and quite frankly, from the necessary benchmark. That I don't think necessarily means it's been a complete failure. I sort of vary from glass half full, glass half empty on this. It is good the world is getting together, clashing heads together, and trying to come up with something. We had an incredible development last night with the Chinese and the Americans saying they're now going to work together, and that's a really big deal because these 2 economies compete furiously. They don't want to see each other outdone by being more green than the other, or vice versa. Someone described it as a nothing burger because they said absolutely nothing apart from we're going to work together, but not how. So I think some progress has been made, clearly not enough. I hope they agree at 4 in the morning tonight or 4 in the morning on Saturday morning to come back and do this all over again, either next year or by the latest 2023, because we desperately still need to make more progress.
Quite impressed. That was a really good summary, Tom.
Well, thank you.
It's my specialist subject.
It's not that bad.
It's, you know, there's a very good political take on what's going on. Look, we don't know yet, and I realise that sounds like a cop-out, pun intended, with 3 days to go, but they're always like this. This is not my first COP. In fact, I came here straight from the COP in Glasgow, but they always, the kind of really crunchy stuff, the difficult stuff, the stuff we knew that was hard a year ago, we have to make decisions on. And very roughly, I agree with Tom that the biggest miss at the moment is the overall ambition. We're trying to get the commitments from governments down to 1.5 degrees.
And do you think that can still, at this stage, be pulled back? Or is that horse bolted now?
I remember in Paris saying I would eat my shoes if we got a global agreement. I didn't go through with that. It's one of the promises I didn't keep, but we did get one. So the optimist in me thinks it's not too late. We've had some surprise, ambitious things. Even in the last 24 hours, a group of countries committing to phase out oil and gas, for example, and the US China announcement yesterday. I don't think we're going to get all the way there. For me, the thing is, will we get far enough along the road to send a really good signal? And this is the bit that Tom didn't say. I work in the private sector now because as a former climate activist, I see the private sector moving faster than government. It was a really remarkable COP because business was there in force, and sometimes that's viewed with cynicism, but most of the businesses I work, in fact all the businesses I work for, but most businesses I saw there were deadly serious and very, very annoyed that ambition wasn't there. And the reason is simple. The economics on energy have changed. The future is in green electrons. Everyone knows that, not just for the moral mission now for climate, but also just because that's where the money is going to be. So what business is looking for from the governments is enough of a signal that the kind of global market moves. And we may get that. So I'm glass half empty, glass half full too. I'm very tired, so I'm very grumpy. If any government leaders happen to be watching this, or negotiators, and why are you, go back to work. But I'd say do better for my daughter, do better for all of us in this room, do better for the country. But don't do it just because it's the right thing to do when we need a habitable planet. Do it because otherwise, if you stick to fossil fuels, you're going to get left behind where the economy is going.
All right. Man there in the blue top.
I think what we're seeing is different interests at hand from different parts of the world. Like you say, particularly the private sector are way ahead in looking at investments to be made. And I think it calls for a question of whether the government were quick enough to act on it before others were.
Yeah. All right. The man there in the blue shirt.
Does the panel think that carbon net zero is achievable, given that everything that we do produces carbon, everything that we produce produces carbon? And do you think it's achievable by 2040?
All right. Then let's hear from the woman in the green top there.
So I've recently started a job in energy supply chain and actually renewables, so it's a good time. But I suppose my question for the panel is, with electric cars being mandated by 2030 and 2050, our energy, we're going to demand double the amount we're currently demanding. And with an energy crisis, how are you going to deal with that? Does the government have a plan?
All right. Well, Lee, I'll come back to you on that. Alastair, do you want to answer the original question? Has COP26 been a success?
I mean, I think it's too early to tell, quite frankly. And even when we get to the end of it, it'll be too early to tell because it will depend on what then flows from it. Yeah. I actually think these big, I know people can say they're talking shops and just jamborees and all that, and every big event always gets that. But actually, if you track back, I mean, I can remember when we were in government, when John Prescott was in charge at Kyoto, and all the same arguments. But actually, if you think back to then, we have come an incredible distance. Yeah. And, I also think even just the fact of the governments feeling the public pressure that they feel, I think that Greta Thunberg has just had an extraordinary impact on this debate. I think the younger generation are really kind of driving this change. So I'm not hopeful that there'll be a deal that everybody will sign up to and everything's going to be marvellous, but I am hopeful that this is going to be part of a continuing pressure that eventually will lead. Yes, I do think that those targets can be reached, provided that pressure is kept on and provided governments really, really do seek to deliver on the promises that they make, which, by the way, particularly in the democracies, are incredibly difficult to do. So I would say the hard stuff starts on Monday.
Lucy.
Well, look, it is too early to say, but I think, look, we all need it to succeed. We all want it to succeed. I think as things stand, we are some way off it succeeding on its own terms. Its own terms was to implement the previous agreements, which were that we would halve global emissions by 2030. And the UN report that was out just a few days ago showed that we are, even with the commitments that have already been made at COP26, we are quite some distance from that. And it's all very well. The government will, I'm sure Lee will say, about countries that have made net zero commitments into the middle of the century and beyond. And that they're all well and good, but they're not going to deal with what's being called this decisive decade, where we really need to make some big changes in this decisive decade up to 2030. So governments and politicians can promise that they'll do things by 2050 or 2060. They won't be around at the time to be accountable. What matters is what governments are going to do here and now. And this transition that the lady in the green was talking about there as well, you know, I think we can...
Electric cars.
About electric cars, the whole thing, about switching our energy, about the transition that we need to get to net zero. A lot of the technologies exist. What we're not doing, and we don't do this, we're not doing this in this country very well here either, is really winning that global race in investing in the capacities, the production capacity, spreading out those technologies across the country. And we could here in Hartlepool, which is famed for steel production and nuclear energy, you know, we could be winning the global race in these new, decent green jobs of the future if our government had a better and more realistic and properly invested in plan that we could win this global race. And it could be regions like here in Hartlepool that once powered Britain through the Industrial Revolution that can power Britain again in a green revolution. But I'm afraid the government is falling short on this on many, many levels.
Man here in the front, the stripy tie. Yes.
Yes, thank you. And I think this is for Emma, and perhaps Alastair will not blame Boris for this one.
Well, I'm going to bring Lee in a minute because he's the one person who's had a chance to answer, but OK.
If we could drill down into the detail, and you've said we must get away from fossil fuels, the bit that puzzles me, and perhaps you could offer the answer, is that trees are good. We're told to grow trees. But on the other hand, we're cutting down swathes of forests in the USA, Canada, the Baltic states, turning those trees into wood pellets, powering the Drax power station, which now creates more CO2 than it did when we were using coal. And yet we're sitting on top of dead wood, coal. So why aren't we using coal, which is less polluting than wood chips? And related to that is we don't have a energy security. We import gas, we import electricity. We should be pushing hard for nuclear power, I would suggest.
All right.
And Rolls-Royce has come in there to give us a hand. But how can you explain that cutting down trees is better than using dead wood?
Emma, can you briefly just address that?
Briefly describe the energy transition. So look, in the UK, the energy mix is going to be, by 2030, actually, so we're going to decarbonise the power sector in the 2030s. And this kind of answers your question too. It's very, very possible the technology.
No, but to the very specific point of cutting down trees.
And we're going to, in that mix, according to the Committee on Climate Change, to get there, we're going to have biomass, but with something called carbon capture and storage on it. And that's the thing that in Drax's business model I'm personally really excited by, is they're developing called negative emissions technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Trees are also a negative emissions technology, but this is the man-made version. And we know we need both to get to 1.5, so they could be world-leading in that technology. The rest of our mix is going to be largely offshore wind, like the wind farm out at Blythe, or onshore wind, like the wind farm down the road. You have a very cool job, by the way, in the renewable supply chain. We're going to have a lot of that in the UK. And then a mix of nuclear and possibly burning hydrogen as well, so lots of technologies. It's very, very doable. I am telling you that the energy industry sees that as the economic future, the technological future.
So should my next car be electric or hydrogen?
Oh, definitely electric.
OK, right.
Yeah.
I need to get to Lee, because you're the one person who has a chance to answer this. Has COP26 been a success?
Well, let's see. We're not there yet, and there's several more days to go. But
do you think it's been a success so far?
But I think there are some good indications, and you've seen some announcements on methane, some announcements on cars, some announcements on forests, some announcements on coal. And I think that demonstrates a desire from all of the countries around the world, or most of them that have signed up to it, that there is progress and people want to move forward. But I would just say one thing, that, you know, the UK has shown real leadership in this. And I think the one thing you can argue is that the Prime Minister has shown real leadership in this. But it's building on top.
I'd like to argue that.
And I'm sure you would, Alastair, and it doesn't surprise me at all. But that's building on top of a lot of work that's been done by other governments before. And the United Kingdom has a good story to tell, 44% reduction in emissions over 30 years. But we never must forget that the targets we have set ourselves are incredibly challenging, and we've now got to get to work on those. 2050 net zero is the most challenging thing in the world. And the thing where I disagree with people like Greta Thunberg is they just pop up and say random numbers. Actually, 2050 is the most challenging thing going, and we've got to all focus on that to get that, because it is possible, and the fantastic approach of the private sector will get us there. But if we can do it, let's go.
Let's hear from the man at the back, yes, in the grey top there.
How can we trust this government on COP26 when you had an Environment Secretary back in 2019 that promised us live on television he was working with one of the leading manufacturers to have bottle buyback systems within supermarkets within a couple months, and we're now nearly 3 years later and still no bottle buyback.
And who is it exactly that you're talking about?
Michael Gove.
Michael Gove.
Yeah.
Okay. The man there in
Never
the...
knowingly undersold.
The man there in the jacket and tie, yes, with the glasses.
Are any of the agreements that are made legally binding? And will there be any penalties for countries that legally agree it but don't actually conform to it?
Okay. And the man behind you in the blue sweater.
I mean, there's been a lot of hypocrisy at COP26, people flying in the private jets from all around the world. Joe Biden was in Rome with 85 cars, I believe. Hypocrisy all round. I think I'll just join in with the Greta Brigade. I don't like her myself. I don't think we should trust everything she says. She's not a scientist. She's not educated in this. She's
pressuring.
She uses scare tactics, and it's leading to things like people on the M25. It's leading to people who don't know the science, thinking that the world's going to end in a few years, which it's not. It's going to heat up. The scientists agree with that. There's a big margin of error, especially when you go 50, 100 years in the future. You don't know how much it's going to go. But I believe those scare tactics aren't helping anyone.
Okay, just very quickly, Emma, before we finish.
So on the science, you're right, there's a big window, but the science is not for negotiation in these talks. And actually, I'd say that's one of the relatively remarkable things about Glasgow is every country, partly because we can see it, and it's in line with what the models say, can see that the costs of not doing something are far greater than the costs of doing something. On your point about, I've heard lots of people talking about what politicians need to do. Look, this is one of those things where everyone now agrees it's an issue. Politicians are all saying it's important. What we really need is kind of action, and particularly critical action for the next decade. And that is the stuff that we're looking for out of the agreements that are made over the next 36 hours. And for this government, there's lots of crunchy stuff in our way. Someone mentioned EVs earlier. You mentioned EVs and how that fits with the change. Yeah, we can do a lot in the private sector. We want to, but we're highly regulated. We actually do need government to remove some of the stuff in our way so we can do things like deploy EVs.
All right, hang on. Yeah, you all want to come in. Our hour is up, I'm afraid. I'm very sorry. I know, it goes so quickly. But our hour is up. Lots of you got your hands up, so forgive me, I'm not going to get to you. We're out of time. We could talk about this for ages, but we're out of time. Thank you very much to the panel for coming tonight. I'm sorry to cut you off. Thank you to our audience here in Hartlepool. And, of course, thank you also to you at home for watching from Question Time in Hartlepool. Bye-bye.